I traveled to the Ukraine and met a couple folks named Vova and Victoria. Vova and Victoria were one of the leading drug dealers of their city in the Ukraine. After a reckless life of drug and alcohol, substance abuse, their marriage fell apart. They went their separate ways. Vova, over time, got arrested and was thrown in prison for drug trafficking. He grew up as an atheist, didn't even believe there was a God. And he was sitting in this cell, and to make matters worse, doctors told him he had a terminal kidney disease. They said, "You have months to live." And he sat in that prison cell knowing he was about to die. He lost his health, he lost his marriage, he lost it all. And in that moment of desperation, he cried out to God. He said, "God, I don't even know if you exist. I've never even talked to you. But God, I'm in desperation. If there is a God up there, would you touch me?" There was no Bible, there was no chaplain, there was no pastor. But there in that prison, God came down and touched that body of my friend Vova. He went to the doctors days after. They did all the scans. He says, "This disease is gone. You have been miraculously healed." Vova that day made a commitment to the Lord, said, "God, I can't believe this. There is a God. The moment I get released from prison, the very first place I'm going to go is a church." And that's what he did. He was released from prison, walked out literally the penitentiary, and the very first church he saw happened to be a Pentecostal church. He walked in. They happened to be having a service. He came and he sat near the back, and the pastor was preaching the gospel. And after he preached the gospel, he said, "Is there anybody who wants Jesus?" Vova came to the front, and with tears in his eyes, and he literally collapsed at the altar, and he says, "I need Jesus in my life." And that night, he accepted Christ in his life, and everything changed. Weeks, months ahead, the pastor mentored and discipled him. He began to grow in his faith. And then one day, he said to the pastor, "I don't know, this is so weird, but I keep thinking of my ex-wife. I know I'm divorced. I don't even know if she's alive. I haven't talked to her for years." Pastor said, "Well, why don't you just pray for her?" And that began a journey for him, and he began to pray for Victoria, weeks, months, years, every day. Didn't know if she was alive, didn't know where she was. And then one Sunday evening, as he was in church, he was sitting in the front, he heard the back door of the auditorium open. He looked back, and guess who walked in? Victoria. She looked terrible. She looked like she was hit by a truck. She was in a horrible state. She walked in, and pastor was preaching the gospel, and she came to the front, and she began to cry, and she began to accept Jesus into her life. That day changed her life forever. She got up off the ground at the altar, looked, and there was Vova, and Vova looked at her and said, "Wow." And God began to restore them. The pastor began to counsel them, and guess what? Restored their relationship, and they got remarried. And they began to grow in the Lord. And then after months of growing in the Lord together, the Lord began to call them into ministry. And they went to the pastor to say, "Pastor, we feel God's calling us to be a pastor." And so they went and got training, and they planted a church where they would sell the drugs. They planted a church. And there my wife and I went and helped them start and launch this church. And God started to do such amazing things. Friends, that church of about 100 a few years ago, I want to tell you, today is a church of 20,000 people. And they have a television program that gets broadcasted all over Europe. Friend, I tell you this story because I don't know what your situation is. I don't know how bitter the circumstances, but you serve a God who can turn the bitter waters into sweet waters. It's not over. Don't quit. God can do things you would have never hoped or imagined. And I pray that you keep walking the 7-mile road, because Elam is around the corner. Friend, I love you. May you be blessed today.